Well, by now you have heard that Republicans have finally chosen an individual they could get behind to be the next Speaker of the House. Of course, that being Mike Johnson of the state of Louisiana. And a lot of people out in the countryside are asking, who is Mike Johnson and how will his speakership impact agriculture? Joining us today is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Ethan Lane. And Ethan, you joined us a few weeks ago, right after the speakership was vacated by Kevin McCarthy, and it's kind of been a very turbulent 3 weeks, I guess. What has it been up to this? What has it been like up to this point, and what's it like now that people can almost have a sigh of relief that a speaker has finally been chosen?
Well, I think that sigh of relief is the right way to describe it. There was a time there over a few weeks where I think there was a feeling throughout Republican politics in Washington that there was no candidate that the House Republican Conference could coalesce behind as their new leader. Certainly, we saw some of those votes play out on folks like Jim Jordan from Ohio, Tom Emmer, Steve Scalise, all viable members of Congress, tenured Republicans, members of leadership who couldn't quite get there. I think a lot of people were shocked by the emergence of Mike Johnson from Louisiana as the new speaker, and not just as the new speaker, but with a unanimity of voting in the House Republican Conference, something that nobody expected. But those of us that have worked with Congressman Johnson, now Speaker Johnson, over the years, we've had a long-standing relationship with him at NCBA. He's a principled conservative. He sees the world very much like our producers around the country do. He believes in limited government. He believes in free markets. He believes in traditional rural community values and perspectives. And he's going to be somebody that I think is going to be very easy for the cattle industry to work with. His brand of conservatism is different than a lot of the sort of sometimes fact-free kind of populist views that we've seen lately. Shut down without a plan, blow up the bridge without an escape route. He has a different approach to these things, and I think that's going to resonate. It's going to take him some time to find his way, but we're very excited to work with him.
So, as we look at the House finally getting back to business, there's been a stopgap that has been funding the government since the end of September, first part of October. I guess that's going to be the main priority for the new speaker. And obviously, USDA, FDA funding bills are a part of that. How is that going to shape up? And then also, what are the talks of trying to get a farm bill up and going again now that the House is back in session?
Well, yeah, obviously the main priority is that fiscal deadline that is looming the week before Thanksgiving here in Washington. That is going to be the focus, I think, for new Speaker Johnson and his team for the next few weeks. They're already at work on Capitol Hill processing some of those appropriations bills, getting that process moving. But inevitably, that is going to mean a conference with the Senate and some sort of a combined bill at some point. We're hearing that could be a shorter term extension, again into maybe January or April, in order to buy a little more time to work out a larger deal. It's pretty early in the process to see if that's the case or not, but that seems pretty reasonable to me. As far as the Farm Bill, we know there were extensive discussions in those House conference meetings where they did candidate forums and had sort of endless discussion with prospective speaker candidates about their intentions in this space. And farm state Republicans did a really good job in those meetings, as I understand it, pushing those speaker candidates to commit to moving a farm bill. To commit to that process on behalf of cattle producers and agricultural producers across the country. Speaker Johnson, as I understand it, did make that commitment that he's going to move that bill. He has been a guy that has been in favor of farm bills in the past. We don't anticipate him being a roadblock there. He's a constructive guy. He's going to be faced with the same reality as everyone else has been in this farm bill conversation, that, here we are almost to November. We're a month past the expiration of the current farm bill. We don't have text yet on both sides of the Hill to discuss publicly. There's a lot of work left to be done. It is highly unlikely there's going to be a bill done by the end of this year, and that's what we're hearing from Ag Committee leadership is kind of the deadline where you're going to start to see real impacts to commodities from that expired farm bill. That means that whatever kind of funding mechanism comes together here in the next few weeks really probably needs to include an extension of that farm bill that's long enough to give everybody a little bit of space to work on the next farm bill and get it done. Maybe that's a year. I've even heard some people say 18 months to get out of this Congress and these tight margins that are impacting everything that happens on Capitol Hill. I think those options are probably fairly reasonable options at this point. We're starting to hear more members of the Ag Committee recognize that publicly. Up until now, it's kind of been me and Chuck Grassley from Iowa that have been saying for the last month or two that we just need to get an extension done here and give ourselves some breathing room. But that seems like the likely course of action at this point.
And so, as you mentioned in those behind closed door conversations that Republicans had, we shouldn't expect any big changes to really the format. Almost a replica of that 28 bill. Obviously, when producers or folks hear of a new, more fiscally conservative Speaker of the House, is there risk of seeing some of the existing programs cut back a bit, or is there the hope that this will continue almost a duplicate of that 2018 Farm Bill with some changes, of course, along the way?
Look, I think the challenges that Chairman Thompson and Chairwoman Stabenow have been navigating are still at the forefront. Right, there are a lot of mouths to feed, both literally and figuratively, and a limited pot of money to accomplish that. Nobody's dollars, and no one knows this better than producers and listeners to your show. Nobody's dollars are going as far as they did in 2018 when that bill was passed. Everything costs quite a bit more than it did then, and that means all of those programs cost more to just maintain service delivery at the level that they're at now. Never mind making up ground or adding to some of those buckets. And that is going to continue to be the challenge. Yes, Speaker Johnson is very fiscally conservative, but you can be fiscally conservative and also work through these processes with the recognition that business has to get done. And I think it's an approach difference rather than a perspective difference on the amount of money being spent. I think that Speaker Johnson is probably a little more realistic. We saw that ag appropriations bill go down in flames on the House floor in late September because the cuts were so extreme that farm state Republicans started voting against that bill. There's your blueprint. Yeah, you might lose the Freedom Caucus into the spectrum with a more sort of saleable bill in the Senate and the president's desk, but you've got to hold together those farm state Republicans, or you have no support at all. And so he's going to have to keep an eye on that as this process moves forward. And I believe that he'll do exactly that. I mean, he's a pretty pragmatic guy. He understands the different needs in his conference, and I think he's the right guy to navigate those waters.
Well, obviously, the attention has been on the speaker's race over the past 3 weeks, but I know NCBA continues to work on multiple issues that impact the cattle business. And of course, the fall run is at its height right now. We have semis going up and down the road. Outside my operation here, though, it's probably the trucks are going a little slower. We got about a foot of snow in the last 24 hours. So things, glad we got rid of our calves last week, to tell you the truth. But Ethan, could you maybe share an update on some of the trucking regulations and priorities that NCBA is advocating on out in Washington, D.C.? It always seems that there's something new coming out regulation-wise to hinder the transportation and humane transportation of cattle from, cow-calf country down to feedlot country. What are things looking like, and what are some of the issues popping up here this fall?
The old battles that we've been involved in for so many years are still at the forefront. These ag appropriations bills are not just sort of conceptual things that we deal with in Washington. They have real priorities in them, whether we're talking about agricultural appropriations, whether we're talking about energy and environment or interior appropriations, or Department of Transportation appropriations, where we have language in these bills that has prevented ELD mandates from going into place for cattle producers across the country, where we've looked for an expansion of hours of service, whether that be back end 150 or front end 150 air mile exemptions for those hauls to give our haulers a little more flexibility. Truck weights continues to be an issue that we're trying to navigate, where you have states, kind of a mosaic of different weight limits in various states, and a need for a better federal standard that raises that limit of what can be hauled safely across the country for those haulers that are crossing 7 states at a time on some of these hauls. So all of those issues remain at the forefront. We've seen FMCSA in the last year, about this time last year, I think actually, put to bed some of those old petitions that predated that last back end 150 air mile exemption that we were able to secure. So we're in an environment now where we look for where the next opportunity is to move the ball forward and make sure we have enough time on the clock for those animals to get safely to their destination, without having to adhere to a standard that's really designed for toilet paper and non-perishable goods rather than live animals that need to get somewhere safely and efficiently.
And what is the talk about putting a speed limit on what truckers can drive, Ethan? That's been a little bit of talk recently too.
Yeah, no, and that goes into that same bucket, right? We have a demonstrable record of safe hauling in this industry. Nothing illustrated that better than COVID, where you saw that emergency declaration for several years allow our livestock haulers to move cattle throughout the system as needed, given those plant shortages and those awful problems that we encountered in the supply chain during COVID. The bright spot of that whole exercise during COVID was an illustration of just how safe our livestock haulers are, just what an exemplary safety record they have. And we need a regulatory structure that recognizes that and gives them the flexibility they need to get somewhere quickly and efficiently. And that includes speed as well, as weight and as well as duration. They need that entire package in order to make sure they can get their job done in an efficient manner. So we're going to have to continue to engage on that front. And obviously, the other end of that spectrum is highway safety folks and some interest in the trucking industry as well, that are looking at that larger landscape and unfortunately still don't quite understand the difference between the needs of somebody hauling live animals, versus, like I said earlier, somebody hauling an inanimate object that's not perishable. It's an entirely different set of needs, and that needs to be recognized in this conversation.
My last area before I let you get back to your day out in Washington, D.C. Obviously, Grizzly Bears, the Endangered Species Act, that's something that our audience is very familiar with, whether it is grizzly bears, prairie chicken, whatever it might be. But the latest effort by the Biden administration to possibly reintroduce bears into that Northern Cascades ecosystem, a lot of opposition from agriculture and land use groups out in the Pacific Northwest on that. What is that process looking like, and what are some of the elected officials from that region doing to voice their concerns with that possible reintroduction effort?
So I was with Congressman Newhouse, from Washington on Friday, and we were having this conversation. And he made, I think, a really good point. He said people have got to stop calling it a reintroduction because that implies that they were there in the first place, and rather than the natural migration in that area that we can expect, versus the environmental community and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Biden administration wanting to do what the environmental community is often guilty of doing, which is sort of trying to manipulate nature, for their own gain. Re-injecting or injecting species into an ecosystem, in order to achieve some perceived benefit or placate, quite frankly, audiences of support, whether that be in radical environmental groups or whoever else, almost entirely focused on people who don't have to deal with those animals once they're actually in those ecosystems. It is fine to think that bears are majestic if you live in a condo, in downtown Seattle. It is very different to deal with those animals if they're being placed into your backyard and you have to deal with them in the morning when you walk out of your house. So we have got to keep pushing on the need to base this in the input of the communities that you will be impacting with these. I made this comment in an ESA roundtable on Friday. You're quite literally injecting a deadly virus into these communities by forcing these species into these areas. Whether, to your point, the black-footed ferret, a conversation that never goes away. The wolf conversation now with Colorado, forcing that issue of wolves, into their state. The grizzly bear conversation, the North Cascades ecosystem. This is the federal government playing God with species, and it's completely unacceptable. We're going to continue to fight as hard as we can to oppose these initiatives, and if we can't get it done in the regulatory process, I mean, we're going to have to go to the next steps in court or wherever else. But we can't allow this to continue when we know what effective state management and a real management structure looks like. It's not this.
Well, again, Ethan Lane with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association joining us from Washington, D.C. today, covering just a few of the topics that the team out there works on day in and day out for cattlemen and women. Ethan, thanks for joining us here today.
Great to be with you.
And with that, friends, for more of the information that we talked about here today, along with all the issues impacting farmers and ranchers across the West, visit westernagnetwork.com.